Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, does the Buddha's teaching evolve over time?
It does and it doesn't. It is all the Dharma. It is all the ultimate truth. However, as his disciples become ever more adept in the practice, so too do the teachings become more and more subtle and complex.
But there are those among the Sangha that protest or question the newer teachings, thinking that they don't align with the older ones.
Indeed there are. While it's true that it's all one teaching, there are times when the Buddha must explain the connection, if not for the person asking, then for the entire assembly between the new teaching and the old.
So one of the Buddha's more learned disciples must dampen his own enlightenment for the sake of teaching the less learned?
It appears that way.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Sariputra. Who is Sariputra? What role does he play in the texts? How does this role change over time? We hope you enjoy. So, who is Sariputra?
Sariputra was one of the Buddha's earliest and most advanced disciples. He's known in China as Shelifu or Shelei-zi, or as Sharihotsu or Sharishi in Japanese. He was and still is regarded as the second most awakened in the entire community, second only to the Buddha himself. According to the Theravada tradition, a Buddha always names 4 disciples that are the main or principal disciples, and these are always 2 male disciples and 2 female disciples. And the reason that he does so is to divide up some of the responsibility of shepherding the Sangha between all of them. They're usually the most awakened and the most advanced disciples. And out of all of these 4, for Shakyamuni, Sariputra was the most advanced. The other male disciple was Maha Madhyayana, and the 2 other female disciples were Khema and Upalavana. Sariputra was born in Nalaka, which is quite near Rajagriha, where the Buddha did most of his preaching. And Sariputra grew up together with Maha Madhyayana as friends in their childhood. Together they decided to renounce and to become ascetics at one point, and they tried to follow this one particular master around and try and practice according to his system, but they found themselves unsatisfied. And so they parted ways, and they promised one another that if they found a good teacher, they would inform the other. So Sariputra ended up finding one of the Buddha's first 5 disciples, known as Asvajit, and Sariputra asked him to summarize the Buddha's teaching. Asvajit uttered a very famous and important Buddhist line in response, and the line was, "Of those phenomena produced through causes, the Tathagata has proclaimed their causes and also their cessation. Thus has spoken the great renunciant." This was enough to convince Sariputra to join, and so he had to go and get Madhyayana to join as well. The pair were immediately declared to be the Buddha's chief disciples, because he could see that they had exerted themselves for countless previous lives in this kind of religious exertion. Sariputra was regarded as the very most wise, the very most advanced in knowledge of the teaching, and Madhyayana was regarded as being the most skilled with supernatural or psychic powers. Sariputra truly was well learned in the Dharma, and often preached in the Buddha's place. He was also very observant in the Vinaya, or the monastic rules, the rules that the monks and nuns had to follow. And he was said to even reveal the Abhidharma literature to the world after the Buddha had taught it to his mother, after his mother had passed away and been reborn in one of the particular heavens. The Abhidharma is the Buddhist philosophical discourses and commentaries on the sutras. Sariputra is also credited with keeping the Sangha together and even repairing it a little bit after the Buddha's cousin, Devadatta, created a schism in the community and alienated half of them. He's today worshipped as a bodhisattva, and in fact in the Lotus Sūtra he receives his prophecy from Shakyamuni that he will eventually become a fully realized Buddha in the very distant future. He died shortly before the Buddha did, and he actually has a stupa at Nalanda in the state of Bihar, where his remains lay and where respect is paid to him very regularly. Bihar is very near where the Buddha did most of his preaching.
What role does he play in the texts?
Sariputra is usually the one who is acting as the Buddha's interlocutor. He asks the questions and he prompts the Buddha to teach. He's said to know what the assembly of people and bodhisattvas and pratyeka Buddhas and creatures and gods and so on are thinking. And so he's able to ask questions that they have or voice concerns that he knows that they have. And he's also often seen asking clarifying questions. So whenever he thinks that someone might not understand the teaching in the audience, then he's often asking questions to prompt the Buddha to explain in some kind of different terms. It would be a useless task to try to list off every single sutra where Sariputra has dialogue, let alone every text where he is mentioned in the audience. That's how widespread he is in the text. He comes up extremely often. In all texts where he has dialogue, he represents, in sort of a verbal or debate fashion, a systematization of the Buddha's earliest teachings. He often tests disciples on their own knowledge of the earliest teachings, and he debates with them. And he prompts the Buddha to teach about them and in relation to them to the assembly. He also represents the highest level of realization in the earliest teachings. That means that when it comes to the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, of karma, of the Eightfold Path, of establishing the foundation of meditation and all that stuff that came up comparatively early in the Buddha's teaching career and is represented in the Pali Canon, Sariputra was a master, second only to the Buddha himself. He often asks questions that tie the topic that the Buddha is preaching on back to those earlier teachings. And some even argue that the reason for this is to establish the fact that all of the Buddha's teachings are regarded as internally coherent and not contradictory with each other, even if they do change over time. And so Sariputra has to ask these questions and prompt the Buddha to explain how the later teachings connect and build on the earlier teachings, and how these same things, like the Four Noble Truths and suffering and karma and the Eightfold Path and so on, how all of these things are still present and exemplary in the later teachings, in the more subtle and complex teachings. In later texts, he's also seen debating with different characters other than the Buddha, advocating for superiority of the earlier teachings, trying to convert people, or trying to lambast people who don't observe the monastic rules correctly, and so on. And to that end, it must be said that Sariputra is the most highly respected of the Buddha's disciples among the assembly and among different schools of early Buddhism. And we have to keep that reputation in mind when we read later Mahayana texts where he gets treated kind of badly. While we may be reading them in our own modern Western context as making a fool of him, we also have to note that the reading audience back in ancient times in Asia knew of this reputation that Sariputra had, and they had a very well-established opinion of him. And this opinion was one of respect and admiration. He's still very much thought of as a very wise master to this day, and even though the Mahayana texts have a different role for him to play than the earlier texts, he's still very important to the Buddhist community, especially the early Buddhist community.
I have a hard time squaring that with what we've just in the sutras we've read. He's not treated with respect in these. Like the writer of the sutras that we've seen him in, where he's treated as a fool. He's treated as somebody who doesn't know anything. I have a hard time squaring how this pre-established reputation of respect and admiration can possibly be compatible with, like, he's there as the straw man for Theravada to be beaten on by the Mahayana teachings, is what seems to be happening in these sutras. So, like, how does a reader of these sutras square that circle?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that part of it, like I said, has to do with us reading in our own modern context and reading what's going on thematically and argumentatively in the sutras as being mean to Sariputra. We have to understand that in a lot of cases, the way that people read sutras was different than the way we're reading it on the show. It's different than the way that people are reading them in practice and how they're using them, and it's different from the way that people read them back in different time periods, right? So we're reading them as trying to convince us of the Buddha's teaching and setting up an argument system and trying to be convincing. And we're reading them as a dialogue between competing schools of Buddhism and branches of Buddhism. And we're reading them as political documents, so to speak, in the midst of the early Buddhist ecumenical structure. And we can't really expect that anybody in ancient times read them that way. And in fact, it's hard to even say that people in ancient times and in different cultures as well read them for the content and did as deep of an analysis of the content that we do here. Sutras, as we've said before, are very important for recitation. And each word in the sutra is very important and very well respected and very much venerated for the recitation purpose. And Shariputra's name, just uttering that name in a recitative context, is said to produce a lot of merit. And when you approach it that way, when you approach sutras as ritual texts, then you're not really seeing Shariputra get beat up. You're kind of seeing a play. You're reciting a play. And that play being recited by you and by everyone around you, that recitation is what produces the merit that comes from the sutra. So it's kind of like reenacting something like that. So they're not imagining Shariputra as the straw man. They're actually imagining him as being wise enough to know that he ought to take that role on as being the straw man. Or they're respecting the fact that he's very, very highly advanced and well-versed in the early teachings. And they're understanding that, of course, he's going to represent those, and he's going to ask questions about those. And even though he is the most wise and advanced of the Buddha's disciples, he's still a disciple. He's still not there yet, and the Buddha is there, right? So Mahayana or not, he's never going to win an argument against Shakyamuni, right? It just is kind of prevented by the way the texts are set up and by how we ought to think about them and how they want us to think about them. So it's kind of like we're reading it academically and in a scholarly sense, and they were not reading it that way for the most part over time and in different cultures and places. That's something that's very recent and is very Western of us to do.
Okay, that makes some sense. I still don't see how somebody listening to these sutras couldn't notice that, oh, by the way, we've made Sariputra into the idiot in the room. I guess it's just like the context is too far away for me to fully grasp it, I suppose. It's just seems like it's pretty clear that he's there to be the whipping boy. And I mean, I guess if I was about to say maybe that's needed for the teaching, but no, the term I just used was whipping boy. And at that point, you've already got a toxic relationship baked into the story. You know, this is again me going as a 21st century agnostic, but if you're supposed to be respecting a figure, then why, like, being treated that badly, even for being wrong? Like, it's one thing to be wrong, but it feels like he is called not only wrong, but hilariously, comically wrong. He becomes a joke in these, and that's not a figure of respect, I think, in my head at least. I don't know.
I agree with that. And as we discuss how his role changes over time, it might complicate things if we understand that Shariputra might not have ever historically been involved in any of the situations where he's turned into a clown. He might not have ever been present or involved in these sermons and been made to look like such a fool. The Mahayana authors of the sutras might have written him in figuratively, not to go after him personally, but to go after what he represented, the earliest teachings, right? And so whenever they're making a whipping boy or a clown out of him in the later texts, we can't really be sure if they're making a clown out of Shariputra the person, or if they're making a clown out of the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path people who are very much still dedicated and devoted to the path of arhatship and not the path of the bodhisattva or the Buddha path.
I have thoughts on that, but I think those thoughts will be more coherent after we go over the next part. So let's get back to the script for the moment. How does, we've already previewed this with the nature of my questions, but let's go into it in more detail. How does Shariputra's role change over time?
In the later texts, we can see Shariputra being a stand-in for what is called the Hinayana, or the lesser vehicle. This is another name for the path of the Arhat, like I said, of which Shariputra was the most advanced. In his debates against the Mahayana, which is the greater vehicle, or the path of the Bodhisattva. So he was actually kind of standing in as a character representing the older teachings, the Arhat path, and the Mahayana authors were trying to argue for the superiority of the path of the Bodhisattva. The Pali Canon mostly argues strongly in favor of the path of the Arhat, but it doesn't always do so. We should note that there are texts in there which are very respectful and admire a lot the path of the Bodhisattva. But they are mainly saying that what's the most accessible and the most, I guess you should say, efficient for the individual is to take the path of the Arhat, which is to renounce and to study the Pali Sutras and to meditate for 3 Mahakalpas until you attain enlightenment for yourself and then achieve nirvana without remainder. During this time that you have renounced and that you're meditating, this 3 Mahakalpas, you must follow all the Vinaya rules, the monastic rules. You have to study the Abhidharma texts, and you have to focus on your own practice. The later texts, the Mahayana canon, the Taisho canon, for example, questions whether all of this is very effective, and they question whether one needs to renounce, whether the best option is to meditate and study in solitude, whether the monastic rules or the moral rules of Buddhism really reflect the correct understanding of the Dharma, and so on. They argue that it's not productive to become so attached to the teachings and the rules and the structure of the earliest teachings. They question dualistic understandings of gender, morality, enlightenment, suffering, and so on. They argue instead in favor of the path of the Bodhisattva, which we've talked about before a lot. It's the path of meditation, practice, and study, but all for the sake of saving all sentient beings, instead of for the sake of achieving nirvana for yourself without remainder. Achieving nirvana without remainder is still a goal, but only once all sentient beings have also been enlightened. That's why they call themselves the greater vehicle, or the Mahayana. It has more beings on it, and the Hinayana is the lesser vehicle, because it only represents one person. Some Mahayana texts even question if the enlightenment of the Arhat is even like the highest level of enlightenment, and argue that there are levels of enlightenment that are higher. For example, the next highest would be Pratyeka Buddha, and the next highest would be Bodhisattva, and the highest level of enlightenment would be the enlightenment of a Buddha. Because there is this shift in the teachings, Shariputra is often written into the Mahayana Sutras debating the older teachings, the Arhat path, with the Buddha or other characters who are debating for the Bodhisattva path or the Mahayana path. Some have speculated that this was actually the authors anticipating critique of their text from the majority Arhat practitioners. Whenever you release a text, whenever you release a sutra, whenever it's widely read, you have to understand that your audience is going to most likely be people who are Arhats, people who live in southern Asia and who practice in monasteries. And so they must anticipate that if they're going to really radically question some of these fundamental pillars of Buddhism, that they're going to get some blowback. They're going to get some really, really controversial, polarizing results, right, because of doing so. And so they write Sariputra into the text in order to head those off, in order to kind of anticipate the debate that they don't want to have with everybody, right? They want to write their own solution into the text. They want to defend the text within the text. And that's why it's doubtful if the historicity of the text really should be understood as Shariputra being in the presence of the Buddha, being beat up verbally, right? Being disrespected verbally. That's not really entirely possible to know if that was happening, and it's not really likely given what we know about early Buddhist Mahayana versus other teaching divides that we see in history. Either way, at least in the texts themselves, Shariputra is absolutely made into the whipping boy or the fool of the community. And that's kind of not okay, like we've been talking about. There's in fact a time where he's turned into a woman, because he doubts the enlightenment of a goddess. This happens in the Vimalakirti Sutra. There are times where the Buddha talks to him in a way that seems really mean to the reader. This is very frequent across the Mahayana canon. And there are times where he asks seemingly unwise or stupid questions and has to have the Mahayana teachings explained to him like he's a baby, in a highly simplified way. This can be read as the Mahayana authors insulting his intelligence, going after Sariputra the man, or it could be read as Sariputra prompting the Buddha to explain things in a simple way for the rest of the audience, or it can be read that he's a stand-in for the majority Arhat path practitioners that these sutras would be read and authored by. But either way, he gets treated much worse in the later texts than in the earlier ones.
The very concept, which we have mentioned before, of the later teachings being more refined and being meant for more refined audiences, in and of itself is insulting to older traditions. And I don't think there's a way to get past that with the way the sutras are written. It's baked in that a lot of the Mahayana sutras are just really insulting to older practices, and I don't see a way around that.
And I would also add that some of the critiques that they have of the older teachings don't really hold up. When you look in the original Pali Canon, I mentioned that, of course, it is arguing specifically for the Arhat path in some cases, in very popular cases, in very widely read cases, and obviously it was interpreted that way by a lot of people. But to say that it just disregards the Bodhisattva path, or it disregards the non-duality of the Buddha path from the other paths, is pretty much incorrect. And to say that it really is only like an individual enlightenment, an individual nirvana in the Arhat path is also a little bit incorrect, right? I'm not as well versed on Theravada philosophy, Theravada doctrine that is different from Mahayana, but I can say for sure that there are specific reasons why the Arhat path is talked about more in the Pali Canon than the Bodhisattva path. Bodhisattvas are acknowledged and they are admired and respected and venerated and worshipped, but the argument is that there are so far fewer of them than there are Arhats, and it's so much more difficult to be a Bodhisattva. They have statues of Guanyin at Theravada temples, and they pay respects and recite sutras to Guanyin and other bodhisattvas of mercy, of wisdom, of practice, and so on. And so obviously the bodhisattva respect is there, but the argument is that bodhisattvas are like Jesus. They only come once in a generation, right? And once in a generation is even too much. They come once in like the living memory of a species. And so because of that, there's too much in between us and nirvana if we take the bodhisattva path, because that's enlightening, like I said, every sentient being ever, or you'll never get to nirvana that way. It just is, it takes too long. And the Theravada tradition also, I should mention, believes in the existence of Ācantikas, those beings which cannot or do not ever reach nirvana or reach enlightenment or anything like that, either because they just reject the teaching or because they just don't pursue the teaching, they don't go on the Buddhist path, and over infinite time, they just never get there. And so they're arguing that the Bodhisattva path is, in that case, impossible. You'll never reach nirvana if you are trying to enlighten Ācantikas, which cannot and will not ever be enlightened, right? And given the law of large numbers, they're arguing there's innumerable beings in the realms, right? And so you can go to all those realms and you can try and enlighten all those beings there, but there will always be like a core group that you just can't access, that you just can't convert, that you just can't get to accept the teaching or pursue the teaching or shepherd them to enlightenment or to nirvana. It's impossible. And so their argument is not a rejection of the Buddha path or the Bodhisattva path. It's actually arguing that it's not as common as the Mahayana is arguing, and it's arguing that what is actually easier and more conducive to a better life is to just stick with the fundamentals, stick with what the Buddha gave us early, the easy stuff, right? And to say it's easy is not even fair either. You know, they spend lifetimes meditating on that stuff, on suffering, on karma, on non-duality, on emptiness, on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And so what they are saying is what we have on our plate is kind of enough. It takes 3 Mahakalpas, right? The Mahakalpa is, an immeasurable amount of time. It's borrowed from Hindu mythology. It's the lifespan of one of the gods, right? So it's millions of years, millions and millions of years. It takes 3 of them to get anywhere close to enlightenment, if you know what you're doing. And they're arguing we don't. So it's more of a practical argument, and it's much more of an argument of we need to figure this stuff out first before we can ever even hope to be a bodhisattva.
I would also say, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but also isn't part of being an arhat also helping to enlighten other people?
Yeah, I mean, you're performing it for them. Yeah, you're doing it. And if we believe in non-duality truly, like if we take that and take it to its logical conclusions, then whenever you become enlightened, that whole process creates merit for you and everyone around you that witnesses that or is a part of that in some way, right? So they do recitations, they do rituals for the community, they do funerals, and they do weddings for the community, right? They're not alone in the woods seeking this eternal life in nirvana. They're actually like plugged in, just like everybody is, right? So it's renunciation in the sense that they are getting rid of material attachments, and they're getting rid of desire as much as they can. But at the same time, they're not leaving the world in the way that a lot of people think. They're often very much a part of the world. And in that regard, because they're on the path of enlightenment and in the world, how is that terribly different from what they are arguing that bodhisattvas ought to do in the later texts? I don't think it's that different at all.
Well, we're a pair of 21st century Westerners trying to figure out something that I suspect has been debated for over 1,000 years at this point. It's hubris at best to think that we could actually come up with an answer here. I think it's fair to say at this point that I have a bit of a Theravada bias. I tend to agree with what the Theravada teachings say over the differences with Mahayana, but also it's just a matter of what one believes at that point. There's not much use in actually debating that. I'm not going to be able to convince a Mahayana practitioner that the Bodhisattva path is that rare, because that's how they believe. Just the way that they're not going to be able to convince me that saying a Bodhisattva's name 10 times is enough to get enlightenment. But it's all a matter of belief at that point. So I'm not sure if there's much more to say. It's just two different religions that have the same start point at this point, I think.
It really is. And, this isn't something we need to get into in this episode, but I do encourage people to think about how this would all look if you step outside of doctrinal debates and you start to look at history and how that affects things. How does history and culture and geography affect how Mahayana develops in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, and how Theravada develops in India, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and so on? We have to be mindful of the fact that these doctrinal developments and debates are not happening in a vacuum. They're happening in the midst of every other type of history happening. And it's 1,000 years plus, like you say, of history. And so we have to also note that there should be consciousness of that when you're looking at this debate, and we should note that that's participating in how this debate comes to us, and it's participating in how this debate is shaped and how it goes on both sides. So at that point, I don't tend to think of them as two separate religions, but I do tend to think of them as being pitted against each other in a lot of ways, and taking a lot of similar steps, but also different steps from each other in that regard. Because like I said, they recite, they worship at statues of bodhisattvas, the Theravada do. And, at the same time also, the first thing that I'm sure that you're going to learn if you join a monastery in China is like the first sermon, right? If you have never heard of Buddhism before and you step into that monastery, it's very likely that, you're going to need to catch up. And so I think that it's very messy and soupy and has to do with so much stuff that is not Buddhist doctrine and not Buddhism that it's impossible to kind of pick apart why something like this has resulted in all of this denominational sniping that we've talked about.
At this point in the original recording, my microphone decided to explode. So, fortunately, we were at the end anyway, so let me just read you out here. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode about Sariputra. Join us next week where we will discuss Buddha nature. What is Buddha nature? What are the doctrinal roots of the idea? How do the meanings of it change over time? We hope to see you there, and thank you for listening.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hinüber.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.